But okay, so then you do the restructuring thing, and so was that? You said they adapted the group to move people over to restructuring. So were they mostly like tech bankers originally, and then that got converted to restructuring, basically?
Yeah, so at the time, Jeffries was not as large as many of the other banks, but they had a very elite specialized group doing restructuring banking. They
Mm,
also had a technology banking group in Foster City. So from a Bay Area standpoint, the expectation was that you could work on technology if you were in the Bay Area. You could also work on restructuring projects.
yeah.
And then in New York, they had a huge team, and that team was organized by different industries, and they had, leveraged finance and all of that. Basically, when we got into training in the summer, they decided to just put all those people into restructuring because that's where all the work was going. And so, every analyst that was joining, even the guys in Texas who were like, yeah, I'm joining for oil and gas, like they were doing oil and gas restructuring. And I
Mm,
think that was an interesting observation I had around restructuring is kind of a horizontal craft, just like M&A is horizontal. You can apply that skill toward anything, LevFin similar.
yeah.
Whereas if you come in with a specific industry vertical that you're supposed to be a subject matter expert in, you start to get very, very specific, and you start to get very specialized. So I was grateful with the benefit of hindsight. Learning as much as we did in restructuring was awesome. Circuit City bankruptcy was obviously very high profile, and so I was just like drinking from the fire hose. And then there's this company called Rath Gibson, which was out in Illinois. I got shipped out there as an analyst to help them rebuild their financial model as they were entering a bankruptcy process. And if you ever want super intense kind of modeling training, go do that. Like basically I sat in a conference room for a week with the CFO, and
Yeah.
as kind of a immediate post college guy who was still learning how to do everything, I was rebuilding a weekly 3 statement forecast for him. And it was just the most fascinating thing because the question was not like, okay, how do we grow revenue? How do we grow profitability? The question was like, based on our P&L, how do we extract more cash out of our working capital
Mm,
management? And so it was just an incredible crash course in the puts and takes of running a business, making financial decisions for a business, and keeping a business alive, and then getting creative on the balance sheet around how much debt can this business support? How do I convince creditors to do that? How are they going to look at risk and interest expense or interest rates on the debt that they give us? It was really fascinating top to bottom. And so I came out of, a year or 16 months or so at Jeffries thinking, man, I just got some of the best training I think I could have ever asked for. And it was exhausting, of course, but it was worth it.
yeah. At the time, I'm sure you were super tired. In hindsight, you're like, wow, that was amazing. I mean, honestly, you're probably what, 21, 22 years old at the time?
Yeah, 22.
Most 22-year-olds do not have a seat at the table for that kind of discussion, that kind of just important decision making process, right? So I think that's what people talk about when they talk about the learning experience in banking. Because I think restructuring is actually obviously back in '08, very timely given where the market was. I think we're kind of at the point in the market again after a very long time where a lot of people think maybe we might go into a recession, right? Who knows? And also, I find from working with students a lot over the past 8 years, like restructuring has become more and more popular in recent years, especially because a lot of the elite boutiques, like the Evercores and PJTs and Lazars of the world, Moelis, they all have a restructuring practice. And so there's more and more interest now. Like back, honestly, when I was in college, I didn't even know what restructuring was. Do you have any advice for people who are interested in going down that career path? And also, are there things that they should think about, whether it's, pros and cons? Like, for example, when I think about restructuring, one concern that I might have if I were a student is like, is this a career that would only do well during recessions, which only happens once in a long while? And then like during the rest of the time, maybe it's not as good of an experience, or like, what are your thoughts on that, I
Yeah,
guess?
it's a good question. I guess there are some pros and cons, again, looking back at the experience. So, on the pro side, like I said, the training is just incredible. I still use some of the instincts that I gathered in those first 16 months of my career in this job now. Like when we look at companies that we want to acquire, I want to see their 3 statements, and I'll look at their balance sheet sometimes, and I'll see some things that just instinctively I'm like, that seems weird. We should ask about that. And that's not normal training for most people who are doing kind of growth software, growth tech, M&A, right? You don't kind of think to poke holes into things that, or you may not even know that things look unusual. So
Yeah.
it's great to have that. One of the other pros that I would highlight that's really kind of time specific was if you go where things are really intense. At the time, restructuring was as intense as it's probably going to be in our careers. The formalities of the banking job, the suit and tie, the pomp and circumstance of pitching, a lot of those formalities go away, like by force. It certainly wasn't anyone's first choice to ship me out to Illinois to sit next to a CFO that we were advising, but there was just so much work to do that they had to do that. And when those formalities drop, you really just have a chance to be intellectually honest, to learn quickly, to ask questions, to say I don't know, and to get coached and to get mentored. And so um, I can't promise that in this environment right now that restructuring is going to lend itself to the same learning curve in the same time frame that I had back in 2008, 2009. So then I guess one of the cons would be if folks are interested in restructuring now, I would just be eyes wide open that it's a very specialized form of banking. I do think it's really relevant. I have immense respect for credit investors, for LevFin. Like, there's so much that they understand and that they dig into that I don't think all equity trained folks really, really think about.
Yeah.
And restructuring will teach you that. So that's great. At the same time, I came out of restructuring not really knowing how to answer simple questions about M&A because we just didn't do. We were so far from thinking about accretion dilution and what would make a business trade at a higher multiple if it was
Yeah.
pro forma with another company. So there was a lot of other learning I had to do to pivot into Morgan Stanley when we went there. And I was really lucky, to be honest, that Morgan Stanley was kind of looking at me and saying, well, he's got a ton of training, but he has no idea how to do IPOs, how to do acquisitions, how to do follow-ons. I was like really sharp on debt placements, but
Yeah.
that wasn't the bread and butter for Morgan Stanley. So I would say just go, like, you're lucky to get a job kind of anywhere in banking if you can get one. If you go into restructuring, just be eyes wide open and maybe take some time separately to practice or to train yourself on some of the areas that restructuring doesn't touch.
For sure. That makes sense.